Alright, I'm going to talk about antisemitism and anti-capitalism in the current economic crisis. And even though we heard already a lot about antisemitism and radical left critique, and rightfully so I think, I want to make a case for it nevertheless, and show how it's possible making a radical left critique without being anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, and so on. I think this radical critique of capitalism is already necessary to understand capitalism, as this is the environment where capitalism grew, and it is necessary if we want to fight anti-Semitism to talk about these various structures to make it possible. Alright, in this paper I have a theory part in the beginning, and the second part is going to be a case study of an Austrian newspaper dealing with the economic crisis and anti-Semitic stereotypes in the beginning. This critique of capitalism can of course be dangerous as well, as you've seen yesterday. My point is that it has to be radically, and it's really the crucial word in this. And we're going to the Latin root of radical, radix, meaning root, in social sciences, meaning going to the roots of a problem, and go to the fundamentals and talk about this. So there is, of course, it can be problematic, and Theodor Adorno, Frankfurt School's Kohler saw this problem. It's a quote: "Not anything that tends towards extremes in whatever dimension can be considered radical, but only what attacks the negative situation at the root in an inconsiderate critique of the status quo." So that's the important thing between this extreme and radical, to make this point that radical is the necessary thing. I will get to the problematic side of this later. Because if you don't do it, it leads to a superficial analysis of capitalistic system, and you're not able to get to the ideological undergrowth and get to the real root of the problem. Alright. There's always been a strong affinity between anti-Semitism and anti-capitalism throughout history. From Schiller, the usurer, to court Jews and Baron Rothschild, and the East Coast bankers of nowadays. There's always been this connection. And Jews have always been made responsible for the burdens of a proto-capitalistic society in European history. It is necessary to understand anti-Semitism, of course, as a problem of the anti-Semites, and not of a problem, and it's not affected by Jews or how they do, what they do and what they don't do, and not the state of Israel is doing and is not doing. It's an inner conflict within the anti-Semitic individual, and not a reaction to real empirical outer world experience. So this is it's necessary to understand the whole phenomenon. There are inner conflicts that are then projected onto the Jews. That's what I think is the core of anti-Semitism. Antisemitism has to be understood within this framework of capitalistic society, I think. Adorno and Horkheimer, in their Dialectic of Enlightenment, made this case in the third thesis, in their anti-Semitism thesis. They say, quote, "Bourgeois anti-Semitism has a specific economic cause, concealment of domination in production." So this concealment in production is very important, as anti-Semites usually only see the circulation sphere, which is the visible part of this whole capitalistic mode of production. So they can blame the Jews for these structures they are able to understand, and blame it on the visible agents of this system. It's kind of a conformist rebellion against the capitalistic system, and conformist rebellion is a term that Klaus and Adorno named it an authoritarian rebellion, which means, of course, it's kind of a rebellion. It helps to get rid of prevented drives, but it's not touching the system as a whole. It's not, in fact, a radical critique or something. It's just a very superficial one. Nevertheless, it has to be understood that it's not just the subjective problems of the anti-Semites, but there are objective reasons for anti-Semitism. This turns a feature-corrected ideology that Marx used to describe capitalistic society, and Moshe Postone, professor of history at the University of Chicago, made it useful then to understand anti-Semitism. Postone's understanding is a bit of further development of Adorno and Horkheimer in some sense, in one part, basically. And he's thinking that not only the circulation sphere, but the whole abstract side of the capitalistic system is the problem of anti-Semitism. So, I quote here: the abstract domination of capital, which caught people up in a web of dynamic forces they could not understand, became perceived as the domination of international Jewry. So that's the whole conspiratorial thing again behind modern anti-Semitism, as Marshall Stone put it. And then you can see the connection to capitalistic society very well, this abstract side, it's in my touch book. This means that for Stone, anti-Semitism is a fetishized understanding of capitalism, and fetishized in the sense that the abstract fundamentals of capitalistic organization, concealment and production, are weighed, and what is left are only the concrete forms, for example, labor, and the essential forms of the commodity. This abstract side is then projected onto the Jews and fought against the Jews and makes it an anti-capitalistic struggle as well. Because he says when you see the characteristics that usually contributed to Jews in modern anti-Semitism, things like abstractness, intangibility, universality, and mobility, these are all also characteristics of the abstract side of the capitalistic system. So they quote, again quote, moreover, this dimension, like the supposed power of the Jews, does not appear as such, but always in the form of a material carrier, such as the commodity. This is, of course, again, an analogy from Marx, and the exchange value needs a carrier, which is then commodity. What happens then is that in this fetishized understanding is that you can romanticize traditional labor, and then play out against other forms of labor. For example, a money owner who earns money from something, he doesn't have to work for the landowner, doesn't have to work with, make a split, and ontologize and naturalize this one side, labor, for example, and the abstract sides can be fought against. And this is what happened, for example, when we talk about financial capital as the evil capital, who's destroying everything and going from place to place and and the other thing is the biologization of capitalism, that society, social structures are biologized and then that they look some kind of natural. And this is very important again to quote, the manifest abstract dimension is also biologized as the Jews. Modern anti-Semitism involves a biologization of capitalism, which itself is only understood in terms of its manifest abstract dimension as international Jewry. We'll get back to this in the case study. And which is going to start right now, so it's just the theoretical part, now case study. I'm going to talk about a newspaper that's called Die Aula. It's an Austrian newspaper, it's a circulation of 11,000 copies, it appears 11 times a year. It's published by an organization with very close ties to the Austrian Freedom Party, which is a right-wing party in Austria. It was founded, it's a extreme right party, it was founded after the Second World War by the former Nazis who then had their own party. And became famous as the party of Al-Qaeda in the 1980s and 1990s. And it's usually between 15 and 20% of the votes in Austria. The authors of the Aula there are members of the FPÖ, the Freedom Party, writing in there, for example, a member of the European Parliament, Andreas Mölzer. Other writers, contributors, Holocaust deniers. Several of them took part in the Holocaust conference, which we heard yesterday from Professor Lipster in Tehran. Nazi romantics, members of German national student fraternities, neo-Nazis, and so on. When I thought about which case study I'd take, whether take the left, the red, the left, I had to find several of the things I mentioned as well. But this one, I took this one because it's important that the Freedom Party, for example, used to be in the Austrian federal government from 2000 to 2007. So these are people who actually have political power. It's not some obscure sect or something. They're people who are in the federal government, for example. The topics in the Aula usually talks about the so-called Verbotsgesetz. It's a law that prohibits the belittlement, the denying of Holocaust, and so on in Austria. They want to get rid of it, of course. Cultural decline of German, Austrian culture, immigration is a big problem for them. Anti-feminism, homophobic issues, US-Israel is one of their main topics, and anti-Zionism. All these pictures I'm going to show are scans from the Aula, such as Heidegger's US-Israel, and this is Rahm Emanuel, Jew, and it's all of the people behind Obama are Jewish and so on. By the way, they always get his name wrong. They always say Emmanuel Ram instead of the other way around. And what they really like to do is to, because it's kind of an uncovering of people don't know that, because they always claim the second name of those people. So like Ram, Israel, Emmanuel. So it's clear to everyone that he's a Jew. So they always make him. Nobody dares to say that we do it. There are several issues within the IASA that deal with anti-Semitism. Among them is the so-called witch hunt of Holocaust-denying Bishop Williamson of the St. Pius fraternity, just a short example. Then the belittlement of Holocaust, this is called the andere Holocaust, which means the other Holocaust, and what they mean is the Allied bombing attacks on Germany, that this was the real Holocaust and what happened to the Jews. The Israel lobby, a big issue in then of course Israel and anti-Zionism very important here. IDF soldiers in Nazi uniforms. But nevertheless, I'm only going to focus on anti-Semitism in connection with the economic crisis. So there could be various things, but I will only focus on these economic things. Oh, I'm not done yet, excuse me. Of course, homophobia, big issue thing. Then international relations is always something concerning Israel, something usually, for example, it says Hungary is the colony of Israel, and Hugo Chavez, although of course a left politician, a big supporter of him because of his connections with Iran, who they also support. This is called the Iran lie, the lies that they are building a nuclear bomb and a data threat to Israel and so on. So these are dealing with international topics. The IASA is a good example for this fetishized understanding of economy, and you can really see this in their coverage. It's always projection and personalization of abstract social relations onto various persons or groups of persons. So in this, they always have these people in the background who of course act for the Jews. It's not the Jews themselves. Remember, Stone said they need a carrier. Right? So in the language of the aula, this is then is a cartoon again from the aula. The globalists and their accomplices, worldwide oligarchic structures, jumping jacks of big money. As is well known in the US, politics is being made behind the scenes, elites, dubious circles, high finance and various lobbyists, APAC, are the financial backers and true rulers. Or the architects of the financial Shoah, who sent Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, AIG, and Washington Mutual into the credit crematoria. This is very disgusting quote again, and like comparing, of course, the economic crisis to Holocaust and yeah, the architects, the Jews did it themselves, and so it's all a bit combined. There are always, of course, this inaccurate accusation, and it is, of course, part of this conspiratorial logic. Yeah, and it's not really, even those experts can't really see through it. It's very opaque and dubious, and it's, of course, part of this conspiratorial logic. They're all acting in the background, you never really see them. And again, a quote from Stoller: "This power does not usually appear as such, but must find a concrete vessel, a carrier, a mode of expression. It stands behind phenomena, but it's not identical with them. Its source is therefore hidden, conspiratorial." So you see, it's very good that this happens in the aula. What they really like to do then again, and which is part of their understanding, is personalization. This usually happens to Ben Bernanke, who is also again his second name Shalom. So again, this. So it says 5-0 for the Jews because they have 5 people in the board of the Fed or something. And Alan Greenspan is the second one they like to focus on. It says like Alan Greenspan responsible for a system of power and money. That's a cover of it. The other thing is the biologization of capitalism. This happens in terms such as, for example, the realm of global neoliberalism, the financial investors as locusts coming and destroying everything. Talking about predator capitalism, we see this big fat man supposed to be capitalism, and the ordinary people are trying to keep it down. Talking about a hydra, or describing banks as ripping wolves. This, of course, is always at the core that there is something as a natural, sane organism that just has to be cleaned of these various parts, and reminds everyone, I guess, on anti-Semitic images who know parasitic Jews living among all the others and so on. So this is what happens when you biologize things. What they really focus on is that interest as the main problem of capitalistic society. So they think that this is a very unnatural growth. It just keeps on growing and growing, and this doesn't really happen in nature. And so they really want to get rid of interest as such. What they do is, there is a German economist and theory who lived in the beginning of the century called Gesell. He became quite famous for his natural economic order. It's called the Natürliche Wirtschaftsordnung, which he says, a theoretical power, interest is the problem of capitalism, you have to get rid of the interest. And his solution to this was, well, the parasitic money owners who don't have to work for their income and so on. It's all very, yeah. And his solution to this problem was free money, IGAP, which is money which has an expiring date. After every month he loses a certain percentage of money, so it can't be hoarded. It has to be, because if you hoard it, you just lose money. No interest, so it has to be kept in circulation. The author of the IASA always often go back to this natural economic order as an alternative to the actual capitalistic system we have right now. This natural economic order is still discussed even in academic circles sometimes, and is now by some groups trying to be brought into left organizations such as Attack. In Attack Germany, there are at least two organizations who want to promote these ideas within the left discourse and as a solution to economic crisis and so on. But sometimes in the other as well as Islamic banking is also kind of a solution, because they also have this no interest thing, of course it's a bit, but it's sometimes also considered as a solution. I'm not going into Gesell very especially, I'm just dealing with his connections to anti-Semitic abbreviated critique of capitalism. I'm only focused on this one. The first one is the biologization of capitalism. Gesell already always talked about this sane body economy, and that you only have to make some kind of adjustments, cut out this cancer of interest to have the same body again. Talks about unnatural growth, exponential growth, that there isn't something as exponential growth in nature and is therefore get rid of it. There's an interest is cancer. Yeah. The other thing is that it's a superficial understanding of capitalism. It only deals on one branch of the whole capitalistic production. It's only interest, nothing else. And this is a very good example for the conformist rebellion that I already mentioned in the beginning. It's not really going to the root, there is no big problem with it, it just keeps on a superficial level, attacks it, and what, when you remember the quote from Adorno in the beginning, maybe extreme, but not radical. So it's a perfect example for this, and I mean, I don't want to say that all of the people who like Gesell or Monica are all anti-Semites, but it is a structurally anti-Semitic theory and always leads to anti-Semitic consequences, as of these biologizations and abbreviations they always make. Oh, well, not yet. Soon. Oh, sorry, I got my papers myself. So, what I'm trying to say is that this conformist rebellion, it gives itself a revolutionary standing, but it is in fact not, and that's exactly the problem. It is what Karl Marx once described as being, quote, within the limits of what is permitted by the police, but not permitted by logic. So it is really this conformist rebellion. You don't really attack people in charge, it's just you attack one part of the society, usually the Jews, but it's not a radical rethinking of this whole process. And to end this, when Adorno and Horkheimer state in the very end of Dialectics of Enlightenment that, quote, it is not just the anti-Semitic ticket which is anti-Semitic, but the ticket mentality itself. This is also true for critique of capitalism, Not just a shortened and explicit anti-Semitic critique of capitalism is anti-Semitic, but this shortened critique as such. Thank you.
Okay, we've heard a lot about Islamist anti-Semitism during the conference. My paper focuses rather on genuine anti-Semitism in Western societies, as it still is persisting. We can say that after the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945, we can observe rising efforts of the Western right to fight organized anti-Semitism in Germany and other traditionally strong anti-Semitic nations in Europe. We can even say that an official state policy opposing anti-Semitic tendencies became the indicator for democratic conditions and the establishment within the international political system. Therefore, publicly outspoken anti-Semitism was more and more prosecuted, both formally and informally, while it remained existent on a private level. This fact was already mentioned by Franz Böhm in 1955 and is called communication latency by Werner Bergmann and Rainer Erb. This communication latency is accompanied, as we heard, by the rise of socially more accepted forms of resentment, such as secondary anti-Semitism, especially in Germany, and anti-Zionism. Replace the word Jew with Israeli and everything's fine, you can say whatever you want. So we get the impression in the last decades, genuine anti-Semitism in Western countries was hardly a thing to worry about, besides from some right-wing fractions. This at least is the message even some scholars of anti-Semitism seem to support. The problem with this finding is that neither of those scholars has a reliable way to estimate the extent of anti-Semitism in Western societies today, since most people will hide their attitudes in those societies. The statements are based on data or surveys which presuppose every anti-Semite would not hesitate to tell us what he thinks about Jews. Survey methodological works, however, have shown that individuals will answer in a socially desirable manner when it comes to sensitive issues. So, my paper puts a very simple question. How can we reproduce the actual attitudes of interviewees, which is very important for fighting anti-Semitism, when we can assume that interviewees are lying? And we can put it more technically and less ontologically, how can we improve the validity of our measurement instruments? The first step towards the development of a better measurement instrument offers the same paper by Bergman and Erb, and they say that anti-Semites articulate their attitudes in, as they call it, consensus groups, which consists of people that are perceived to hold the same attitudes in regard to Jews as the anti-Semitic individual herself. And this implicit note on the influence of reference groups on the communication of publicly sanctioned attitudes, such as anti-Semitism, leads us the way to determine the relevant mechanism of the generation and communication of anti-Semitic attitudes, and especially the latter, the communication of anti-Semitic attitudes, is of importance here. There's an underlying assumption I want to make clear. We can distinguish a public norm against anti-Semitism, and this I define here as commonly shared expectation that anti-Semitism will be sanctioned both formally and informally if articulated in public situations. On the other hand, we have a primary group norm. This is the shared expectation of a small, definable private group, such as families and peer groups, of what happens when members of this group articulate anti-Semitic attitudes. Now, on the level of attitude generation, that is how the actual attitude of an individual develops, we can say that the primary group is of more importance due to considerations of Leon Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance. If individuals would hold attitudes that are not in accordance with the primary group norm, cognitive dissonance would occur. On a more important case of attitude communication, however, I assume that the respective impact of the public and primary group norm is shaped by the definition of the situation. In public situations, the anti-Semitic expectations lead to the avoidance of anti-Semitic statements, while in private situations, the respective primary group norm is of relevance. If now the primary group norm and the public norm diverge, it can be assumed that a discrepancy between public and private situations occurs. In public situations, individuals holding anti-Semitic attitudes of relevant degree won't communicate their attitudes straightforward, but will adjust their communicative behavior to the public norm. In private situations, however, the public norm loses its impact. If now we suppose that interviewers interpret surveys as public situations, we can observe a significant difference between the actual attitude and the communicated attitude. And to decrease this variance, we have to control the interpretation process of interviews. And for this purpose, I suggest here to activate the cognitions of the primary group norm. And I tried to accomplish that in an experiment with the help of context effects. Context effects is called the influence of previous questions on later questions. So if we ask for the attitude of the primary group before the actual questions concerning your own attitudes are asked, I suppose, on the one hand, that the own opinion is adjusted, while the primary group opinion, with the primary group opinion, and on the other hand, that anti-Semitism increases. The second hypothesis is of great importance because, to put it easy, if we manage it that interviewee is framing the situation in a more private way, we have a more representative polls. And we know that polls are an instrument to shut down critique against anti-Semitism because these voices suppose that anti-Semitism is a thing of the past. So I will now come to an empirical study to prove my point. I asked 241 German students between age 14 and 18 and designed an experimental setting. One group was asked for the friend's attitude before the own attitude was asked, that's the treatment group, and the other group of interviewees was asked for the own opinion first. We have here the items of the questionnaire, which is not of too much interest, but rather a technical detail. Same counts for the distribution here. I mean, I mentioned it anyways. We have 11% strong anti-Semitic individuals and 19 slight anti-Semitic individuals in this sample here. What is of interest is that our hypotheses are validated by this data. Hypothesis 1 is validated by an increase of the correlation if the attitudes of the friends are asked before the own attitude. And concerning hypothesis 2, we see, and this is a really interesting finding, the first really interesting finding, that we have an increase of 0.7 points on a 1 to 6 scale. That means if you use this method in usual polls, you will have a much higher number of anti-Semites, of genuine anti-Semites. I speak not of anti-Zionist arguments, but of anti-Semitism. And we have further interesting findings we can derive from this data. We have three, I would say, state-of-the-art determinants of genuine anti-Semitism. Education, interest in politics, and right-wing attitudes. But if indeed, as our theoretical considerations and empirical data suggests, the reported anti-Semitism increases once the interviewee is less obliged to follow public norms, it is possible that these correlations have been overestimated. To illustrate the point, let's discuss the influence of education. It's been proven in various studies, various empirical studies, that anti-Semitism is more common among poor educated than among well-educated. Now, what if this finding rests mainly on the consciousness of better educated people, that some things, such as anti-Semitism, should not be articulated in public, regardless of what one actually thinks about the matter. In this case, better educated interviewees would lie more often about their attitudes. The same idea counts for interviewees showing a remarkable interest in politics. Those might be simply more aware of the public norm and answer in line with public expectations. Further, I assume that politically left interviewees have greater interest than right-wing interviewees to appear not anti-Semitic due to self-image concerns. And here you can see how a possible mechanism works. If we see that the left is anti-Zionist, but presumably not anti-Semitic. And the mechanism works about social expectations. It's expected from left interviews to be anti-Semitic, while it is not expected from them, or rather the opposite is true, that they are pro-Israel. So they live out their anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. That's my point here. And the data I have at hand, I skipped the statistical magic here because I assume that we're not among social scientists, but rather among historians. What is important here is that these data, if you compare the influence, the statistical variance explained of Model 1 with Model 2, you can see exactly what I just was considering, that we have a substantial decrease of the influences of education, of interest in politics, and political attitudes. My interpretation of that is that once interviewees with higher education, etc., frame the survey situation in a more private way, the difference between them and poorer educated ones decreases. And the main influence is that of primary group. I have to underline that this is not to say that no anti-Semitism among right-wing fractions exists, nor that is as strong in left-wing groups. We can see from statistical data that there's still a higher probability that right-wing individuals will hold anti-Semitic attitudes. But my point is that this influence has been overestimated, and that it's at the time to look at genuine anti-Semitism among the left, and we need the technical instruments, the socio-theoretical and methodological instruments to find out about this genuine anti-Semitism among well-educated ones and among the left. I will conclude that such an enhanced measurement of anti-Semitism does not only offer a more reliable picture about the extent and hence the consequences of anti-Semitism today, but it also helps us to determine what triggers anti-Semitic attitudes. In this regard, it might not be very surprising that primary groups have that much of an influence on anti-Semitic attitudes. but it seems at least counterintuitive to some that it's not merely a favorite toy of bad-educated Nazis, which it is nonetheless. If quantitative anti-Semitism research does not take the normative character of anti-Semitism into account, it chronically underestimates the extent of it and overestimates the correlations with some state-of-the-art determinism. And since it is this branch of anti-Semitism research that makes it frequently in the news, we have to be very careful with our findings. And this small study here should be a first step to elaborate a more quantitative, reliable research instrument. And it also can help us, like I said, to define and find out more about genuine anti-Semitism and detour communications such as secondary anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Thank you.
My name is Stoller. I'm from Berlin. We run a small institute called the National Institute for Education and Research on Antisemitism. This institute is based in Berlin and in London. So I'm the head of the Berlin Institute. The title of my presentation is Modern Capitalist Societies, Impersonal Power and Exploitation Structures, Nation States, and Antisemitism. The purpose of this paper are two things. First, I want to analyze briefly some relations between modern capitalist societies, the system of thought introduced, and the latter relation to modern antisemitism. I attempt to show that the current modern society, which is based on competing nation states, as one argument, produces a system of thought that forms central elements of modern antisemitism. Combined, these elements culminate in conspiracy theories which are projected on Jews. Second, these elements of thought, combined with a long historical tradition of Christian anti-Jewish hatred projected towards the Jews, make it so difficult to combat antisemitism. So these elements of thought cannot be deconstructed easily. They form part of the society we are living in. This is one reason, I think, why it is so difficult to combat antisemitism. In order to illustrate this, I will briefly focus on two aspects of thought in our societies and their relation to antisemitism and anti-Zionism. On the one hand, I will focus on the role of the system of competing nation states with their two hegemonic ideological rationales, the Republican and the primordial or ethnic nation model. Both hegemonic ideological concepts have a specific impact on the perception of the Jews and Israel. Inclusion and exclusion, citizenship, rights of the individual guaranteed by a state, and the right of a nation for its own state depend on the ideological rationalization of these rationales. On the other hand, I will briefly touch, and only briefly because it was already mentioned, upon the relation between the largely impersonal processes and functioning of modern capitalist societies and antisemitism. How do individuals perceive the structures, processes, and the exploitation in our society? And what kind of relation exists between these perceptions and antisemitism? Finally, this paper concludes that a specific connection of both elements, the nation concept and perception of the functioning of this very society, culminates in conspiracy theories which are projected on Jews. In his essay, Portrait de l'Antisémite, Portrait of the Antisemite, Jean-Paul Sartre commented that antisemitism is not just a taste, whether you like the Jews or not. Rather, he emphasized that antisemitism is a worldview that is not limited to be against the Jews. He noticed that one cannot be an antisemite without further intellectual principles, and describes elements of a specific way of interpreting social processes and structures of what I would say modern capitalist societies. In particular, he mentioned a specific interpretation of the nation, but also ownership structures, exploitation, money, etc. Adorno and Horkheimer, but in particular later Moshe Stone, asked about the relation between a specific fetishized perception of modern capitalist society and antisemitism. They stated that based on a fetishism of capitalist structures, anti-Semites relate and is bad perceived artificial abstract sphere like banks, stock market, the concept of the individual, intellect, money, etc. to the Jews, opposed to a concrete sphere like concrete work, factories, and so on, which is perceived as good and organic and related to the nation, people, folk, to use the German term, which is meant not to be Jewish. In these anti-Semitic projections, Jews are the non-workers, exploiters, intellectual bankers, stockbrokers, contrasting with the national community, the real workers, and honestly producing industrials. And the Nazi ideology, this culminated in the odious sign over the gates of the forced labor concentration and extermination camp, Auschwitz. There was written, Arbeit macht frei. Literally translated, work will make you free, or work liberates. Nation as a form of ideology and antisemitism. I want to highlight that the concept of the nation plays a tremendous role in modern antisemitism, which I believe I'm not the only person. Even if traditional and religious elements take part in a transformed form in modern antisemitism is related to modernity and the current form of social organization of this very society, namely the modern capitalist society. We are living in a society in which the political regulation and construction of identity is built up, among others, by competing nation states. Even if there are transnational dimensions of regulation, the main player are still nation states competing with each other. And two predominant rationales for inclusion and exclusion of individuals into and from the nation state can be found. And these are those ideological rationales to legitimate the rights of a citizen, the existence of a state, and the extension of the state territory. You will see later in the speech that these 3 points, rights of a citizen, existence of a state, and extension of the state territory, plays a role either in modern antisemitism and also in anti-Zionism. Two hegemonic nation concepts can be distinguished, especially talking about Europe, but also a little bit about the US, and also in newer nation states as in Arab countries or in Latin America. Firstly, a republican concept based on the rationale that all individuals living at one territory are members of the nation and therefore receive citizen rights. Secondly, a primordial concept based on genealogies, either völkisch, the German term, ethnic, cultural, or religious. Those two models are the two hegemonic models and are, I would say, especially in Europe societies, but not limited to those. Unfortunately, I can't focus on other societies, as in Arab countries, and the complex situation of colonial, post-colonial nation building, and the competing ideologies of nationalism, Pan-Arabism, and Islamism in the Muslim world. It is important to mention that in the hegemonic perception, you can only be or have one real face of competing nation states, you have to serve in the interest of your nation only. Both concepts, the Republican and the primordial one, have their specific impact on the perception of Jews and Israel. Talking about Jews' citizenship and loyalty to the nation. Consider from a Republican perspective the situation of the Jews in the 19th century. Those who supported the political emancipation of Jews, regardless of their religion and culture, often did not like that Jews still believed in their Jewish religion. Religious Jews were perceived as obdurate, so the price or expectation for the right of political emancipation was assimilation. And if the Jews assimilated but claimed to be still Jewish or part of a Jewish nation, it contradicted the loyalty of the nation concept. One nation for each citizen. Let's have a look on the second concept, the primordial one. Three rationales can be distinguished: religion, culture, and folk. Religion. If the rationale of nation was based on religion, it was Christian. If the concept was based on culture, it often implicitly signified a secularized Christianity which did not include any explicit Jewish heritage. If the concept was based on folk, German term, this included a genealogy of blood, and the Jews could not take part of the nation. Within the frame of these concepts, especially assimilated Jews were suspected to destruct the nation from inside the nation. Let's see what happens with Israel. Israel, nation, and territory. When we have a look on Israel and its perception through the lens of the primordial and Republican rationales of nation, we can observe some interesting points. Let's start with the traditional anti-Jewish concept, the primordial one, especially the ethnic one. This concept can be found among either self-identified right-wingers, but also among left-wingers. What constitutes a nation in this perspective? By this concept, a nation is constituted through genealogy, which I already mentioned, ethnic, cultural, or religious. Some consider Jews as a nation, but most do not because they are perceived as a mixed race, as guests among the more nations. And the fathers and mothers of the Jews do not have the same blood. But even if the Jews are considered a nation, the nation concept relates population and territory in a specific form. By this concept, a nation is constituted through any form of genealogy of the population living forever in a common territory, the concept of the autochthonous. From this perspective, Jews are not allowed to live in Palestine as a nation, since from this perspective, the so-called and recently invented Palestinians as a nation are those who live there forever. The autochthonous Palestinians have the right to live in Palestine. Israel is in this perception an artificial construct which has to disappear. Related to this concept are such expressions as Israel as cancer and so on. In this primordial concept, there is no space for the Jews, neither as guests among autochthonous in Europe or other countries, nor in Palestine. Let's focus now on the liberal or leftist concept, the Republican concept, and its position toward Israel. Following the Republican concept, a primordial concept is against universalistic principles. Different concepts can be found in this perspective, which at the end of the day all serve politics against Israel as a Jewish state. Firstly, there's the concept among some leftists, especially radical left, that every nation state has to disappear, a post-national perspective. Mostly the focus is put on Israel, as Israel is one of the most recent states and the deconstruction of nation states from this perspective should be started with the newest one, with Israel, and the Jews should be or live in countries where they are from. But also the concept of a one-state solution, a common Jewish-Palestinian state, meets the destruction of the Jewish state. Also a two-state solution with equal rights for Palestinians and Jews in Israel would cause problems, considering the demographic evolution, even if we don't consider any right of return of the so-called refugees, Palestinian refugees. But what is emphasized most in this perspective is the fact that Israel considers itself as a Jewish state. Ethnic or religious, even definitions remind the Europeans of their history. Whether it is the religious definition stemming from feudalism or the ethnic one prevalent in modern capitalist societies, culminating in the strong nationalism and wild national socialism. Both definitions have been partly overcome in Europe, kind of, and should be overcome in general from this progressive perspective. In this perspective, a nation state with a definition of citizenship by ethnic or religious genealogy has to be fought. So, to fight against Israel as a Jewish state. So those who fought for the political emancipation and equal rights for Jews, regardless ethnic, religious, or cultural genealogies in Europe, nowadays those also who speaking out of Israel are strong enemies of the Jewish state. Such a kind of universalistic perspective becomes nowadays a rationale to fight the Jewish state and its existence. The system of competing nation states and their hegemonic concept does not include a Jewish state, which can serve as a state for all potentially persecuted Jews, if you take it from this definition, or a Jewish state for the Jews. Let's speak about Israel, Jews in the diaspora, and disloyalties. I want to mention the relation of the system of competing nation states and the perception of Jews not living in Israel. From the point of view that every citizen is part of one nation and has to serve the interests of its nation or nation state, every Jew is perceived as potentially disloyal towards the state where he or she is living. The general suspicion of the disloyalty of Jews becomes worse when it comes to Israel. In a society based on competing nation states, every Jew is potentially accused to be more loyal towards Israel than to his or her nation state. Let's talk very briefly about the second aspect I mentioned in the introduction of modern capitalist societies, the impersonal functioning and the perception of processes and structures. How is the functioning perceived and what relation exists to antisemitism? Contrary to feudalism in capitalist society, the production of wealth, exploitation and so on is not effected through personal dominance. No individual is physically owned by another. Every individual has to sell its labor force on the market if this person does not have property for everyday reproduction. The employer does not own the employee. The modern society is based on contracts between two independent and equal individuals. The employer contracts the employee. The employee is free to choose the employer. The employee produces wealth for the employer, and the employee is paid to pay his everyday reproduction. If the employee doesn't receive enough money for his or her everyday reproduction, there is no direct responsible. He or she could choose. Especially during crisis, when employees earn less and or employers cannot accumulate money and or the state fails in regulation, a responsible is being searched. And a common perception, as it was already mentioned before, the banks, the stock, shareholders, multinational companies, politicians are blamed to be responsible. People are searching for culprits and are personalizing the responsibility of the impersonal capitalist society. Here's the point where the system of competing nation-states plays a central role. When the political regulation of the nation-state is not able to guarantee the wealth and the reproduction of its population, foreign sources, traders, stockholders, banks, politicians are being blamed. The cosmopolitan Jews, which are everywhere, which have no fatherland, and are not perceived as part of the nation, are then those who are blamed for the misery and all the social processes which are perceived as bad. This specific connection of the perception of the impersonal functioning of capitalism and the system of competing nation-states culminates in blaming the Jews for a global conspiracy. To conclude, the Jews are perceived as personalized actors against the nations, whether inside our nations and sometimes against the Palestinians. If the Jews are those who contradict the nation-states or the system of competing nation-states, quite systems, and are those who are culprits for the bad, there is only one possibility to deal with it. This is why anti-Semitism, in my opinion, is the most dangerous ideology in our existent society. Thank you. Maybe from my perspective, it would be also interesting to see the case of Venezuela. If there could be find something there, but yeah, maybe there. So.
Yeah, I have a question. I guess mostly for Nicolas and Robin. Even though I found your thing very, very interesting as well. I hope I'll think about that. But, unless we're imagining that we're heading towards a world of, I guess, international socialism without nation states, then obviously we're assuming that we're living in a capitalist society which will be governed by a competition between nation states. So if anti-Semitism is kind of tied to those social conditions, as you're both suggesting, then I mean, I can think of just really two places we can go with that. One would be we're stuck with it, and that would seem to lead us not in a very radical direction in that case. All we have are band-aids to put on it here or there. Or the other possibility is to become less anti-capitalist and less anti-nationalist. In other words, part of the problem is that this assumption that there's something exploitative and there's something physically unjust about either capitalism or nationalism, in that case would be feeding anti-Semitism, even on the part of those who want to separate their critiques of nationalism or their critiques of capitalism from anti-Semitism. So I'll make the question really simple. Both of you kind of stopped at the point of okay, which is kind of a very common way of approaching it, right? To produce a kind of general critique of, say, capitalism, and then as Marx himself did, just kind of leave aside the question of exactly, what happens, right? The workers will take care of it. At some point along the line, Marx himself didn't really have much to say about how it all comes to an end. Either you think that we're abolishing these conditions generative of anti-Semitism, or the question then becomes how to, first change attitude towards nationalism and then capitalism, but also find ways maybe to make them better, to improve capitalism, to improve nationalism in a way that they produce, say, less resentment, less of a sense of injustice, and also less anti-Semitism. So So how would you then, I mean, either of you, both of you, how would you extend your analysis in those directions?
Yeah. I'm a little bit afraid about the answers because I don't have any. Or not really. One thing is, I would strongly advocate for a kind of US model of citizenship, which is not, as in comparison to the European model, based on so much narratives, or not at least in this excluding form. So this is one change I made in the last years, beginning from criticizing the US for a lot of stuff to defend the US model of not really nation state in the European sense. So that's one point. The other point is, I think what I spoke about is the relation between anti-Semitism and the expectation in the state. What the state shall do from the perspective of the anti-Semites, or a lot of persons. Because I would say in Europe is a tendency that every request for regulation by the state goes to a direction which is more fascist direction. I did interviews, especially in Germany, with persons questioning their perspective about differencing. And there's a strong relation between those who advocate for a social state and those who want an authoritarian state.
What state?
Authoritarian state, let's say a kind of fascist state. And so what I'm a little bit afraid of I can't give any answers, because if you want, if you got a perspective like me, that in this capitalist society there is a lot of shit going on and that it should be overcome, I don't have any answer. How? And what kind of society it could be, or what kind of transitional process could take part without getting in the direction of a Stalinization or authoritarian fascist state or whatever, coming backwards to more organic entities.
We either produce, well, if we're doing anti-capitalist critique, kind of enhancing the problem, or, well, we can't really abolish the whole thing right now, but I think what's left out in this kind of dichotomy is, obviously there's people that are not anti-Semitic right now already, so it's always a question of ideology as well, or a question of psychological dispositions. So that might be a point one can start working on right now. Change people's ways of thinking, people's ways to look at stuff. So that would be the first step for any revolution, I think, too. So obviously, it can be something that's
Well, I mean, I can respond to that. We don't talk to each other, right? I mean, in that case, though, so that if you can fight anti-Semitism without taking down the entire, capitalist system, then okay, we can set aside the entire critique, right? So that if anti-Semitism depends upon lots of other things, which I would, of course, agree with, then it's not so much. In a sense, what happens to their analysis? I think in particular, Nicolas's analysis then becomes, well, I mean, what's left of the whole, fetishization argument and so on, that the Jews kind of, which, by the way, I agree with to a great extent. I'll read Nicolas where I kind of make a sort of parallel argument, only from sort of the pro-market side, I guess, really simply. But if you can fight anti-Semitism without, then you add at the end, okay, that would be the first step.
We can fight it, maybe, but we can fight it. Well, you're not an anti-Semite, I'm not an anti-Semite. So obviously, there is differences. Not everybody, it's not as multi-causal as it seems with this kind of critique, which doesn't make critique false. Because
I agree. I mean, there are other problems with critique, but it certainly makes the critique less necessary. I mean, in fact, anti-Semitism has these other causes and can be fought on other grounds and with other means and so on.
Okay, just a short statement. I think that, of course, you're right. It doesn't seem that we're going to live in the free association of free individuals, it's actually critical identity, international socialism, which is not going to happen today or tomorrow. Of course, there is this question, so what can we do about it? But I think it's important to have the perspective in mind, at least, that there is a possibility. And then we can do our daily political work directing into this idea that it could be possible to change. This also means to political problems we're facing right now. And so, yeah, it's, of course it's difficult, but I mean, it's a fetishized understanding, so what we can do is to show these roots of the problems, make it obvious, and then maybe do something as education. It's hard to say. I mean, I think this is a better way to show its roots than some intercultural dialogue or something, yeah, where the Palestinian kids and Jewish kids meet and they paint together or something. I think it's really more important to really show these social structures that make it possible. And then, yeah, maybe, I don't know, education, it always seems a bit naive because it seems so much anti-Semitism and so hard to fight, but yeah, I don't really know. I mean, you have to keep in mind it can get worse than the capitalist society. We know that since we've seen Nazi Germany, yeah. So it's not anything that changes is bad. That's why I want to make the point of radical and not extreme. So we have to keep in mind it can get worse with authoritarian states, fascist, socialist states. So we have to keep that in mind as well.
I would add something to that. It depends on the consideration how close you link capitalism and anti-Semitism. And the reason that anti-Semitism did grow out of capitalism in the 19th century, or the crisis of capitalism, and a Marxian analysis was established by people like Stoller and Nicolas. The point was I think to say we have a better analysis of the anti-Semites of capitalism than the anti-Semites do. And if we have this analysis, we can even fight anti-Semitism within capitalism.
I'm not ready to talk, but I want to send a question to you.
I can give you the example that I know, okay, that is my country, which is Venezuela. Okay, I thought we were a capitalist society, okay, until this new government came in 11 years ago. But also on that society that we were living, for some incredible reason, there was never anti-Semitism, never. Like, for example, a case of anti-Semitism would come up every 5 years. That was it. You know, somebody would paint a swastika, whatever. It was like a Disneyland state for the Jews or for anybody else. It was a very easy society to live in. Everybody integrated. There was really no problem. I mean, if somebody, a Chinese would come in, they would call them, "Hey, Chinese, you are, hey, you call hey, Jew, whatever," and it didn't mean anything. Italians, you know, the whole thing was just. I mean, the Portuguese would call Portus, and they all own the coffee shops or the bakeries, whatever. And there was never any animosity into that. Funnily, when this government comes into power, portraying itself, posing as a socialist revolution, where we're going to substitute this capitalist state for this new socialism of 21st century, all of a sudden anti-Semitism appears. We're supposed to not only not appear, but it's supposed to disappear if it ever existed, you know, because this was an egalitarian society, whatever. But it happened exactly the opposite. I mean, it decided that the way to destroy the capitalist society that existed before, he had to find a scapegoat. He had to find somebody who was guilty. But not guilty for the first year, second year, but forever. Because so they found that the Jews Israel, Zionism, was a very easy thing to latch onto it, and simply everything that was everything happens to be wrong in Venezuela right now is because of the Zionists and the Mossad. So I mean that is so we are substituting for socialism, okay? But what kind of socialism is that, where it actually uses the exclusion and the anti-Semitism card to actually put himself into power? So it's like I don't know if your theory would work. You know, if you say let's do the same in the United States, let's convert this into a socialist society here. Maybe the things will happen.
But I think this it's not a contradiction to what I said. It's more that I would say Venezuela is in the system of competing nation states. There's not a world socialist society. So, I wouldn't say they are socialist or whatever, but that's not a question. I would say Venezuela is also a rhetorical anti-Semitic state nowadays, and that and Venezuela is not the only case. You can also have a look on transition processes in the Arab world or other countries. And so, in my opinion, what's happening in Venezuela is there is still a form of capitalist reproduction. You have to sell your labor force and so on. And the only model which would be possible in Venezuela is even worse, I would say, that everything is owned by the state and everything is related to the state, so that the individuals disappear. The concept of the individual is related until now to a form of organization of the society. So I would say there is a relation between that I have to sell my labor force, that I have to reproduce myself by my own, and so on, to the concept of the individual. So it's not totally separated. And if there would be a change, or if there's a change as in Venezuela, the concept of the individual disappears, and there are two possibilities. Those who fight against the state, taking over everything in the form of production, and those who are with the states, and they will be the anti-Semites, or are the anti-Semites. So for me, it's in this international system of competing nation states, mostly based on capitalist production forms, where Venezuela takes part. And that's for me the dangerous, perspective, because this could happen also in other countries. But I think it's related to this, what I said. It's not like there's capitalism, then there's socialism, and with socialism begins the problem.
No,
it depends on.
No, I understand. I didn't mean it exactly that way. I mean, if somebody knows about socialism, at least in Venezuela, it's me. I mean, I was founder of a kibbutz in the 60s. I mean, where a kibbutz was actually a kibbutz, not like it's now a capitalist production. I mean, over there, it was actually direct democracy. I mean, among the people in kibbutz. But when you try to apply that to a higher society, I mean, for some reason, it doesn't seem to work. You know, because you can't put everybody over there. We were 40 people in the 60s, and we all got together and we decided on everything we wanted, including what we're going to eat next week. Okay? But how do you do that with a country? Okay, so if you replace the individual by the common good, okay, then you end up with no individual.
Oh, did you want to speak to that?
No.
This whole week I've had like 3 favorite presentations. Like your presentation today was the most scary presentation, and the feminist one was the most inspiring one. And I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. Heiko? Heiko. I think your presentation was the most potentially the most useful. I mean, it was astonishing to me that this, because one of my big questions has been, who are the anti-Semites? And we use these languages, well, it's the left. Well, that's sloppy. It's not. We're all the left. Are we anti-Semites? So it's not the left. It's the Islamists. Well, millions of people in the Islamic world who aren't radical Islamists hate Jews. So it's not just that radical Islamists live for that. And I feel like your research is speaking to how do we really find out? And this principle, if I understand it, which is, I don't know how to put it in a simple sentence, but the idea if there becomes an accepted discourse that it's okay to be anti-Semitic, then that true feeling that as many people will come out. But if it's not an accepted discourse, then it won't come out. I mean, I find that as a person who fights against anti-Semitism potentially really useful. I'm not sure yet exactly how, but because I haven't digested it or anything. But I think it may apply to what you're saying, which is Chavez made the public discourse accept this anti-Semitism. So he's saying, they're like asking him, well, what do your friends think about anti-Semitism? And Chavez is saying, well, all us Venezuelans know the Jews are the enemy. So now it's okay for everybody to come. I mean, I just think your paper is potentially extremely useful.
I agree.
So thank you for that. Yeah. And even though there's a few of us here, this is all going to be online. So it'll be accessible, I think.
Thank you.
Well, we have plenty of time on
Yeah,
well, I mean, one thing one point that I'll tell you about Ron's paper, actually, that I didn't want to lose, I didn't find what I was saying before was, I think that the kind of dilemma that situated Israel within, in terms of these competing notions of the nation state, I think is very insightful. I think that's a really productive way to start to talk about why Israel gets targeted from every side. It doesn't quite fit a primordial notion of the state. It doesn't quite fit a Republican notion of the state. So someone who kind of adheres very strictly to either of those conceptions finds Israel to be an anomaly, right? And you always want to get rid of anomalies, right? Because they kind of ruin the system that you're trying to construct. And I think that's that also kind of complicates the question of anti-Semitism because it's a real dilemma, right? That Israel doesn't define itself, it doesn't have a way of defining itself that exactly conforms to the other ways in which nations and states are defined throughout the world. And I mean, my own approach to that has been to say that you have to make a kind of argument for sort of Israeli exceptionalism. And there's no way out of it. That's a very difficult argument to make because it doesn't, again, obviously by definition, it doesn't fit into any system of justification or legitimation of the state. So that's, so I mean, that I think is something we're talking about as well. And one thing that I want to say about, Heiko's paper is you said something you used a very interesting term a couple of times. You said genuine anti-Semitism, and you kind of contrasted that with I took to be implicitly with the kind of anti-Semitism that's being talked about a lot in the conference, whether it's Islamist anti-Semitism or whether it's anti-Zionism and so on. And I think I know what you mean. I think that based on your discussion, what you were getting at was an anti-Semitism that is sort of grounded in personal attitudes and as you're saying, primary group relations, right? Or I guess you could say authentic. Right, or spontaneous anti-Semitism. But then again, it seems to me that what you're talking about is actually very different from that because what it sounds to me, I didn't get to hear your talk yesterday, so based on what you just said now, what you seem to me to be describing is a much more politically motivated anti-Semitism, where anti-Semitism bases itself not on again, this kind of spontaneous anti-Semitism is already sort of out there, ready to be exploited, but more anti-Semitism, which I think is more the kind that we see today, in a lot of cases at least, more anti-Semitism that comes in explicitly as an explanation, right? And that you accept more as an explanation than something that...
How you're going to buy the explanation, if you have the potential to buy the explanation?
That might be, and that might be another kind of study to take up in that case. But I don't think they will always.
I mean, you have, if you look at it historically, it's pretty obvious that anti-Semitism after 1945 couldn't disappear right away. It had to remain somewhere, and my point is that it still is at this location, and we have to figure out how to dig for this location. Some people say it's latent in minds, and I would suppose it's even more latent in discourse. So people actually speak about Jews and what they think about Jews in private, and they are aware of their attitudes toward Jews, but they're just maybe not yet allowed to speak about it in public. Like I said, and I mean, the point is made throughout the conference a lot of times. If you interchange the word Jew with Israeli, you can say whatever you want. But I mean, this discourse has to come from somewhere. There must be some mental location and where it remains. And I think that's the task force for social science to find out about the location.
Maybe there is like when I in my presentation talk about capitalism, so I don't think that's the only reason for anti-Semitism. Yeah, there are different things. Psychoanalysis is, I think, one of the things you also need to explain this phenomenon. The name of Heiko's presentation, but there are no longer any anti-Semites, is actually a quote from The Dialectic of Enlightenment from Horkheimer, from the very last thesis, which was added after the war. The first edition was published in 1944, and I think the last thesis was 1947, something like that. And of course, there are no longer any anti-Semites. It's not, but the public discourse was taboo. There was no anti-Semitism anymore. So I'm from Austria. It's quite similar to Germany. So
it's worse.
Yeah, but it's not on the top level. That's the thing that you try to get out. So nobody says, "Yeah, I'm here and I'm an anti-Semite." Secondary anti-Semitism and all these things, and anti-Zionism as the one main wall for all these prevented energies that are available here and there. Psychoanalysis helps for these things to analyze and try to how to make them. I mean, that's the difficult thing that even empirical analysis, how you make it visible, how to make people talk.
I'm a little disturbed at this definition, but I think it's true that once an action becomes accepted, then it's all right. Okay? I mean, I was a witness in 1989 to widespread rioting and looting in Caracas. I mean, I was there, actually, I was out on the street. And basically, something like 80% of the stores were looted. And all of a sudden, see, like the first hour was only a few focuses of looting. And then it started like a cancer, starting to grow. And all of a sudden, everybody, my neighbors, I mean, I said, where are you going with the pickup truck? I said, I'm going looting. What are you talking about? What is everybody's doing it? So I said, wow, I mean, this is really disturbing. And here it comes almost the same description, you know? I mean, if it becomes accepted in society, then it'll be okay. Then what we're actually looking at, if you try to extrapolate what you say, is that we're looking at a coming Holocaust. Because if it's okay to go after the Jews, because now they became an acceptable target, then it'd be okay to kill them eventually. Would that be true?
I mean, I wouldn't draw these.
It's a little extreme.
I mean, you can apply what you said to Iran. A lot of the population in Germany won't support a military action against Iran because they hold unfavorable views of Israelis, and because they don't take the danger for Israel seriously. Because of these underlying anti-Semitism, I wouldn't say that we can observe or we will observe, and I mean, a pogrom or something in the near future in Germany, I wouldn't suppose that, but it's coming to today in different forms, and politics work in that way, that you have a public opinion towards one issue, and then you can act as politicians.
Well, but it could happen with Islamophobia also. I mean, this Islamophobia thing, it's ratcheting up in Europe, okay, and eventually it may, the Muslims may become the targets of this new program.
Ticket mentality or mass psychology.
Right.
But I think it's one thing is important, and I'm a little bit wondering myself why it's not a topic here at the conference. What is it when we are talking about anti-Semitism? So is it ideology, is it act, or is it act by a state? So, for example, Daniel Goettingen made the distinction, or when he asked why was the Holocaust possible, he said it was a state willing to execute it, supported by a population, and in an international situation where the state wasn't stopped. So these three dimensions of a state extermination project. So if we are talking about anti-Semitism, I think it's mostly we are talking about here about ideology, not about anti-Semitic. Sometimes we are talking about anti-Semitic acts. For example, all the investigation which the CSD in Great Britain is doing about anti-Semitic assaults and so on. So, so we got a dimension of the acts, we got a dimension of the ideology, and we got a dimension of the state and the popular discourse a little bit. So what Heiko said, the relation between the public discourse or the hegemonic discourse and let's say the private discourse, that's one dimension which is related to the state, the latter one, if it's publicly accepted, anti-Semitism, or supported. And if we have a look, for example, from, let's say, Germany, Spain, Morocco, these countries coming to Venezuela, Iran. So in Germany, there's a public discourse saying anti-Semitism is something bad, you shouldn't be an anti-Semite, that's the thing what happened or what went to Auschwitz. So it's this discourse. In Spain, for example, the word anti-Semitism is not known, or it changed a little in the last 5 years. You can't argue that this is anti-Semitism and therefore it's bad. There's no such reference system as in Germany where you can say, okay, anti-Semitism, Holocaust, it's bad. So in Morocco, it's either different. There, the situation is that the parts of the state supports anti-Semitism in the form of anti-Zionism, but defend the Jews, saying that kind of the Jews are also members of Morocco and so on, and we got a Jewish heritage and so on, and does not accept attacks against Jews. So it's not a situation that it's allowed there. So, but what happens, for example, in Venezuela, I would say it's a little bit, it's more, kind of more dangerous because anti-Semitic acts are accepted by the state. So, and coming to Iran is also a different situation. So I think it's important to see the level of anti-Semitic acts, the form which role the place states, and where it can go to make this differentiations.
I have a specific question. One statement you made Heiko says Japanese. Heiko was that people with a politically left orientation have a greater investment in not being perceived as anti-Semitic, and that they then transfer or project that anti-Semitism onto anti-Israel. Can you say what evidence you have for that?
I mean, you have the most recent example is the Gaza flotilla. We had like 3 or 4 members of the left party in Germany among those, and these individuals will deny, they will hardly deny, no, they will deny very much that they have anti-Semitic attitudes. You can simply shut them quiet politically if you say so that they do have such anti-Semitic attitudes, but they will agree that they are anti-Zionists.
Well, was there anything in your research or the groups you did?
Could I add to this? I'll give you some examples. When you say that the Jews have no right for statehood, the only people that doesn't have right for statehood is Jews. That's anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Zionism. When you say that Israel has no right to exist because it has committed, let's say, a human rights violation, as if it is the only state in the world that has committed human rights violations. That's anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Zionism. When you say, as a British intellectual, that Zionism is basically justification of Hitler, because when you argue that Jews deserve a state, you actually justify Hitler, and therefore you have to be anti-Zionist because it's supposedly supporting Hitler. That's, in a sense, you are against the Jews, but you disguise it as anti-Zionism. Or when you deny the rights of Jews to defend themselves, the only country in the world that doesn't have the right to defend itself is Israel. Then it's
yeah. I mean, we missed this presentation, but yeah, I think we all can agree with what you just said. Because you're not going to get an argument here about that. But what was so special about his presentation, he had hard evidence in research groups that showed certain things about people's attitudes when the group was willing, when they were asked what their friends thought, and they could say their friends were anti-Semites. Then, when they're asked what they thought, they could admit to their. So what I'm saying is, in that kind of research, where you had your, statistical information, did you have anything that would support this idea that you present that seems obvious that we all agree on? But was there anything in that evidence in your study that you could apply to that, or does that need to get to be done? Because that would be very powerful to be able to not just have our opinions in a rational sense, but to have that kind of data.
Yeah, I mentioned it as further step. That were my considerations that you can find out more about the relation between these detour communications, such as secondary anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, in relation to genuine anti-Semitism. But in this study here, I didn't ask questions.
So the next study would be, instead of 14 to 18-year-olds, would be to take leftists in groups and create a study that would see what they said in those two different. If their leftist leaders would come out like Chavez and say, all my friends are anti-Semites, and maybe that would change their resistance.
I just want to make sure that Chavez is no left. I mean, it's mafia. Mafia is a different thing altogether. Okay, mafia is mafia.
Well, tell that to even my friends in America who are on the left who love his ass.
Yeah, there are some romanticism about Chavez in the
I would like to add a brief comment. I did a qualitative study, also on German population, asking different things, and we got different types of questions. So it was direct interviews about 1 hour, 1.5 hours. And for me, it was really interesting to form how you ask the question, and there are the different responses. For example, if you ask them, what do you think why the Jews have been such bad experience during National Socialism? The person will begin to rationalize anti-Semitism and all the prejudice come out. Or if you ask the person, what do you think to which extent anti-Semitism still exists today? Or like that they don't feel like individuals, like that they have to act in a social situation in the interview against a different position. I think the feeling of a consent, or at least the possibility to consent with other person playing tremendous role. So I totally agree with you. That's also my experience with, we had We had a questionnaire of 40 questions, and let's say 15 of them are about Holocaust memory and so on, history, the Jews, Israel, Jews, and the US, and so on. And it's very clear to see in which discourses in Germany exist and what kind of answer is being seen as a consent answer, or not as opposing to the person who interviews you. I think it's a very important question, this relation.
As my case study, the right-wing newspaper, you can see the difference with there. Nobody's afraid of being called anti-Semitic. So they are much more straightforward than you would see in other publications. They don't have like this pressure or something of being in a group, and it's just very. I mean, they know exactly what they may say, and they're not allowed to deny Holocaust in Austria, so they don't do it. But they know exactly how close they can get without saying it. So they can really see the difference then from writing parties to parties or people.
I just want to say really quickly, maybe about 2 minutes. I mean, the question that you asked me, what do we call anti-Semitism? And I think it's a very good one because, I mean, what's been examined mostly and kind of grouped under anti-Semitism in the context has been this kind of convergence of more traditional forms of anti-Semitism with now anti-Zionism and anti-Israelism and so on. And I agree with that all these things have converged. But I mean, that obviously wasn't always the case. I mean, this is kind of a historical process. And I mean, if we go back, and someone who said to, Herzl in, 1898, you're crazy for wanting a Jewish state. I mean, I guess that person would be anti-Zionist, but I mean, they wouldn't be anti-Semitic, right? It's obviously the way in which Zionism has ended up, getting intertwined with world politics in various ways that led to this intersection. I mean, for that matter, I'm pretty sure that most American Jews, up through the 1930s, were against Zionism. For various reasons. Maybe they thought it was a waste of time, they thought it wasn't going to work, they thought it would create problems, for them, being sort of loyal American citizens or whatever. I don't think they were anti-Semitic either, right? So these, so these kind of positions sort of hardened and converged, I think really over the last, maybe 30, 40, 50 years. So, I mean, I just wanted to say that because I think that you're right that kind of, sort of tends to get lost when we're all sort of converging ourselves on, this phenomena that everyone finds very sort of urgent today.